Welcome back. I know these are long lectures. Hey, so today we're going to talk about chapter 22 of our study guide. It's fines, penalties, forfeitures, seizures, that kind of stuff. And, I like to keep my lectures short. This is kind of a big topic, so it's probably going to exceed 20 minutes, maybe 20 to 25 minutes. Sorry about that. But let's go ahead and get started. So first off, we're talking about fines, penalties, and forfeitures. And Customs has the legal authority to issue fines or penalties to brokers, as well as importers, as well as returning travelers. Basically, other people or entities that interact with Customs can receive fines, penalties, and forfeitures. Now, don't panic. Fines and penalties do happen throughout a broker's career. But it's not the end of the world, and there's ways that we will see to challenge these in a petition for relief, things like that. First off, there are times where an importer may receive a pre-penalty notice if it's required by law. I know it's kind of like getting a notice in the mail that says, "Dear Tom, we think you were speeding, and so we're letting you know we're thinking about giving you a ticket for it." Right? I mean, it's kind of weird. An importer may receive a pre-penalty notice if it's required by law. Notice has to include certain information, entries, specify laws violated, material facts violated, culpable mental states, just some general information. In general, Customs has this particular issue has not been on their radar screen for many, many years. The actual fines and penalties is what seems to be on their radar screen right now, and we're in 2022. So at any rate, the importer, if he receives a pre-penalty notice, he has a right to respond and say, no, don't fine me. I wasn't really speeding, okay? Yeah, well, okay, maybe I was speeding a little bit, but just give me a $2 fine. I got it. If Customs is issuing a fine that's $1,000 or less, there is no reduction. Customs just issues a $1,000 fine. And or something called a non-commercial violation. I do not have a good example of a non-commercial violation. These pre-penalty notices are set out in 162 of the regulations. I don't want you to spend much time on this, but they're out of Section 592 of the Tariff Act and out of Section 593A of the Tariff Act. That's where those numbers come from. We're going to talk more about those numbers in just a second. Now, let's keep going. CBP will review any response you give to them, and then they'll decide, we're going to go ahead and issue the ticket, the penalty. Right? And if the penalty is issued, an importer will normally have 60 days to respond with what's called a petition to relief. And again, the analogy I'm using is it's kind of like going to court and telling the judge, well, yeah, I was speeding, but my wife was pregnant. I was going to the hospital, or whatever. Well, there were no signs telling me that it was 55 instead of 70 miles an hour. Those are just silly examples. Now, in the middle of all of this fines, forfeiture, and penalties, we've got to tackle something that is called prior disclosures. And this is where you, the importer, goes to Customs before they know something bad was done. And it's where an importer confesses errors to Customs before CBP knows about them. And it's called prior disclosure, disclosing to Customs something bad that happened prior to Customs really figuring it out or knowing about it. And you can go to them and talk to them orally, but if you do, in order to get credit for prior disclosure, you always have to follow up in writing, okay? And the writing must be followed up with, or the oral disclosure must be followed up with within 10 days in writing, right? So I guess we could say it another way. You always got to put a prior disclosure in writing, even if you talk to them about it beforehand. If you talk to them about it orally, you got to put it in writing within 10 days, okay? If Customs lost money, like revenue loss, duty, something like that, you're supposed to tender that duty to them with the prior disclosure. Or if you don't know how much you owe, you are supposed to put in a little blurb that says, I will, provide any lost revenue within 30 days of demand. You got to put in an extra little sentence in your prior disclosure saying that you will give them the money that's owed to them within a certain amount of time, within 30 days of notice, okay? All right, you need to know that a prior disclosure typically mitigates potential penalties, and I've had good luck over time with these things, so it does. Now, what does a prior disclosure look like? It's just a letter. It is theoretically addressed to the Commissioner of Customs, okay? but you print in big letters, prior disclosure on the document. Okay, and you got to deliver it to the port where the event occurred. Even though it's addressed to the Commissioner of Customs, you're going to put attention port director of, port of DFW, whatever it is, Port of Atlanta. And you got to include, you got to identify your class of goods, you got to identify any entry numbers that are involved, specify the act or omission and how and why it occurred, set forth any actual or accurate data, and you got to include a tender of the revenue that was lost or a statement that says, hey, I'll pay within 30 days. All right, so this is that idea of a prior disclosure, and I always think of this as like, going to a confessional box at Catholic Church, and the port director slams the little door open and says, so, importer, you've sinned. Tell me what your sin is. And then he issues whatever the mitigated penalty would be, all right? I'm not trying to get in trouble with Catholics at all, but that's just, something that I think when I think of a prior disclosure is, a little confessional box in the port director going, how may I help you, my son? Okay, now, let's keep going on some other examples of fines and penalties. And we've really got to hang out here. In your book, I have a grid of what types of penalties are issued to importers, okay? And I need you to look at that grid as we go through this, because it sets out, here's what penalties are for importers if no prior disclosure was done, and here's what penalties were if a prior disclosure was done. All right, and so if you're not in chapter 22 of your study guide, your exam guide, I need you to be there. All right, so you also need to be aware that Customs divides these importer penalties into 3 culpable mental states. What was going on in your head when this happened? Was it fraud? By the way, never admit to fraud. Okay, fraud. Was it gross negligence, or was it just negligence? And of course, the fine is worse for fraud than for gross negligence, than for negligence, right? I mean, that's an escalating scale, but these are 3 culpable mental states that Customs looks at for importer penalties, okay? These penalties, just so you'll know, and we're going to get there in just a second, but these penalties are out of Section 592 of the Tariff Act of 1930, okay? That's the law. I know you're going, that's almost 100 years ago. That's the law that kind of guides most of Customs, okay? It's also referred to as 19 United States Code, USC, Section 1592, okay? And so sometimes you'll see on a test these numbers, 592 or 1592. They're talking about these types of penalties, okay? And we're going to keep talking about those numbers here in just a second. So let's take a look at this table. First off, if there's no prior disclosure and Customs thinks you committed a fraud, and there's revenue loss, the penalty is 5 to 8 times the loss of duty, but it would not exceed the domestic value of the merchandise. If there was no revenue loss to Customs, but you committed some fraud, 50 to 80% of the dutiable value, but not to exceed the domestic value. Now, you can always petition for, it's called a petition for relief. It's like once you get this penalty issued to you, you can still go back and say, Customs, I want you to reduce the penalty, and here's why. That's the next video lecture, okay? The next part of this area. If it's gross negligence, 2.5 times to 4 times loss of duty, but may not exceed domestic value again. And so again, no prior disclosure, gross negligence. What if there's no revenue loss, no prior disclosure, and you did a gross negligence, 2.5 times to 4 times the loss of duty. So not much different there. Negligence, 0.5 to 2 times the loss of duty, may not exceed the domestic value. No revenue loss, 5% to 20% of the dutiable value, but may not exceed domestic value of merchandise. So these Customs asks questions on this table, okay? Not every year, not every 2 years, but I want you to be aware of this table. You do need to be aware of a couple things. One, if Customs accuses you of fraud, they can impose a greater penalty than what's on this. It's in the statute. It says they can impose a greater penalty if they determine that it was really egregious, really aggravating, or there's public safety factors, okay? But again, the upper limit is never more than the domestic value. So it could be 5 to 8 times lost duty, but it can go up from that, but never more than the domestic value of the merchandise, right? Also, second thing I want you to kind of remember on this, clerical errors are not violations, are not penalty worthy. So if I put on an entry, it's the country of origin is MX, but I put MS, meaning country of origin is whatever that would be. And I'm not even sure there is an MS, but you understand what I'm saying. Clerical error is not a violation for penalties, okay? Unless it is a pattern or super repetitive. And so I have had that. I had a guy call me, one of my former students, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's pretty excessive. I mean, it was either 83 or 183 entries with the wrong country of origin on them. It was a repetitive entry that he was doing over and over and over and over and over. So at any rate, if it's a pattern of repetitive negligence, that's a clerical error that you can get a penalty on that. Now, what about with prior disclosure? What happens if you go into customs ahead of time and you confess fraud, which never admit to fraud, okay? It's just with revenue loss, it's 100% of the loss of duty. In other words, just pay duty again. What if there was no revenue loss? It's just 10% of the dutiable value. That's pretty dramatic discount when there was no prior disclosure. What if it's a gross negligence? Just pay the interest on any unpaid duty. That's pretty dramatic compared to 4 times the loss of duty, okay? What if there's no revenue loss? No penalty issued. Negligence? Just pay the interest on any unpaid duty. No revenue loss? No penalty is issued. So prior disclosure pays off. All right, prior disclosure pays off. This is a penalty grid for the penalties applied to importers. And now we're going to take a look at where this information is in a different location, okay? So let's take a look at, hang on just a second. I'm going to put something different up on the screen. Yeah. Okay, we're still in penalties, but I want to show you a different area of the regulations where Customs has been concentrating their questions over the past few years. So I need you to find Chapter 171 of your regulations. Now, depending on where you get your regulations, they could look different than this. Okay, they could look different than this, but I want you to find Chapter 171. This is the version that I sell, and I create and sell this every year when they post the changes to the regulations. At any rate, we're going to go, and I want you to flip pages. Okay, we're going to flip pages to, let me get there. It's the appendix. We were just there. Yeah. I need you to find this spot of 171. It's called an appendix. Appendix A to Part 171 of the regulations, okay? And I've highlighted this, obviously. These lines are what I put in my CFR so that people can see where Customs has asked questions in the past. Okay. Everybody there? If you need to put me on pause, but I need you to find Appendix A. Now, here's what I want you to know. A couple of things. One, Appendix A applies to returning travelers. So this is the guy that's coming back from Hong Kong. This is the guy that's coming back from Cancun, and he doesn't declare something, or he, doesn't declare something truthfully, right? And there are mitigating factors and aggravating factors. He's done this before. That's an aggravating factor. He's an inexperienced traveler. That's a mitigating factor. Customs has not concentrated on this little area. They have asked questions from it, but it's been many years. They're not into it right now. Here's what I want you to know, though, on this. Customs repeatedly puts these numbers that I'm kind of pointing out right here, 19 USC 1497, or sometimes it'll just be referred to as Section 497, okay? And USC stands for United States Code. That's where this area of regulations comes from, right? And so you need to, don't panic when you see these Tariff Act numbers or United States Code numbers, sites, references, we can call them different things, but be aware that that's what you're looking at, okay? Now, I do want us to find Appendix B because we got to hang out on Appendix B. So let's flip a couple of pages in this appendix, okay? And here we are. And if you need to turn me off to find it, I want you to, but you need to tab this and you need to highlight it. So Appendix B, 171. I have a little note. Put a little note in yours. Applies to importers. This is what we were just looking at. That table that I have in my study guide, it's this but this is on steroids. A lot more information in here than what that table has. All right, and so this applies to importers. Appendix B 171 are all the penalties that apply to importers, okay? And just so you'll know, this is where it sets out. There's 3 degrees of culpability: negligence, gross negligence, fraud. Okay, and this is where there's a definition of what those look like. And I have this in my study guide. Customs does test that from time to time. I don't know that I want you to memorize it, but I certainly want you to remember this topic. Okay, now, Customs sets out here the additional information that's in this Part B, or this Appendix B, is mitigating and aggravating factors. So that's not on our little chart. But this does have some mitigating and aggravating factors, but it has, all the same fines and penalties for these, how would you say, these penalties that are issued under 592 of the Tariff Act. And I'm going to keep saying 592 of the Tariff Act because Customs loves to put 592 or 19 U.S.C. 1592 on an exam question. And it's irrelevant. It's just to intimidate you. And it's only talking about a penalty, which we have right here in Chapter 22. Let's see. Customs does test this section, but there's one section that does seem to get a little more questions than others. And let me get there. Hang on just a second. I want you to flip the page with me. And again, here's things that would work as a mitigating factor: immediate remedial actions, okay? Inexperience in importing, okay? Prior good records. And do you see that this is a list of mitigating factors? Customs loves to test lists. Which of the following is not a mitigating factor of a 1592 penalty? Okay, that kind of stuff, all right? So here's where it is. Which of the following is an aggravating factor of a penalty issued by Customs under Section 592 of the Tariff Act? It'll sound real formal, and here it is, okay? You don't have to memorize this stuff, but it's good for you to know where these lists are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, A, B, C, D, E, which is not an aggravating factor, that kind of stuff. Okay, so again, these are kind of things that Customs tests. We want to be aware of where this information is. But now I need you to find Appendix C of 171. And we're going to hang out here for a second. And I know this is the Tariff Act. It'll sound real formal. And here it is. Okay? You don't have to memorize this stuff, but it's good for you to know where these lists are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, A, B, C, D, E, which is not an aggravating factor. That kind of stuff. Okay. So again, these are kind of things that Customs tests. We want to be aware of where this information is. But now I need you to find Appendix C of 171. And we're going to hang out here for a second. And I know this is a long lecture, but we're almost done. So Appendix C, I want you to write in your regs, applies to brokers. This is if a broker makes a mistake. What penalties apply to the broker? Okay? And brokers do get penalties from time to time. It's not as common as you'd think, but it does happen. Okay? I've got a friend in Laredo that's got a broker. I've got a penalty going on right now. Something that happened totally not, he had no control over. It's real interesting that we're arguing with Customs over that. But at any rate, so Appendix C is for violations of 19 U.S.C. 1641. That's just the United States Code where this area of the regulations come from. So no panic. If you see something, a penalty issued under 1641, okay, it's right here, okay? This information is not part of the table that we've covered before. That was 592 penalties for importers. This is penalties specific to brokers. So first off, you need to know that you would get, as a broker, you'd get a written penalty notice, and you have 30 days to respond to a penalty, all right? Importers typically have 60 days, but you have 30 days to respond, and you can ask for, an in-person meeting. You can respond however you want to, but that's the penalty assessment. And if you'll notice, that's a Roman numeral 1. And if you need to turn me off to kind of find it, depending on your version of the regulations, I'm okay if you turn me off and you find these things. We're going to go to Roman numeral 2. What happens if you're conducting customs business without a license? Here is the penalties for that, okay? Not on Customs radar screen. What about making a false or misleading statement or omission of of material fact required to be stated in an application for your license? Here's a penalty for this. What if you, as a broker, are convicted of felonies or misdemeanors like theft? You're going like, well, didn't the courts punish me enough? Customs gets to punish you as well. You're probably looking at a license suspension. That's a whole other topic. What about Roman numeral 5? Violation of any law enforced by Customs Service. And this is kind of just a catch-all, you know, that you violated some law. And again, we're not talking about mistakes on entries. That's not it. These are more egregious than that. These are things a little bit bigger than that. I want to point out a couple that Customs has tested. Failure to retain power of attorney from clients. $1,000 for each power of attorney not on file. Okay, ouch. All right. So be aware of that. Knowingly aiding or abetting violations by any other person. And this is kind of like getting somebody else to violate the law with you. Okay. Now, these are where Customs has been really spending time over the last few years. One is knowingly employing or continuing to employ any person who's been convicted of a felony, right? $5,000 penalty for knowingly employing a felon and failing to make application within 30 days of discovering he's a felon. $25,000 penalty for knowingly employing a convicted felon and not asking permission from Customs. Ouch. $30,000 penalty for knowingly employing a convicted felon and continuing to employ him after approval was denied. Ouch. Okay. What about in the course of Customs business with intent to defraud, misleading, or threatening a client? That's probably the great example of wonderful client PR, right? I could not imagine threatening a client, but here's a penalty if you do, okay? Failure of a Customs broker to have a permit broker. Do you remember back in Chapter 10 of our book, when we talked about Customs brokers, you may have a branch office far, far away. I'm in Austin, maybe I have a branch office in Chicago, and I needed to get a broker up there. Well, if that broker leaves and I don't get another broker within 180 days and continue to conduct business, here's the penalties for that. And I'm backwards. There's also penalties if you don't get a broker within 120 days for a corporation or an association partnership, right? So there's what I call it. You need a broker for the business, that's 120 days. You need a broker for a permit, that's 180 days. If you're filing entries past those deadlines, here's where the penalties come from for that, okay? Failure, and then here's where I kind of actually want you to see. You'll see test questions on this section during the 2020s, the early 2020s, like 2021, 2022. Failure of a licensed broker to exercise responsible supervision and control over his business, okay? There's a $1,000 penalty for any broker that continuously makes same errors, fails to properly instruct employees. Do you see this list? A, B, C, D, E. This is for a broker that fails to exercise responsible supervision and control over his business. All right, so you've got different little penalties in here and lists of what Customs can impose on you for failure to exercise responsible supervision and control. I also want you to remember that this was also a definition in 111.1. When we studied Customs brokers in Chapter 10, there was a definition of responsible supervision and control. There's some slight differences in the lists here of what counts, what doesn't count. You can get a penalty of $5,000 any broker who fails to exercise responsible supervision and control over the Customs business. $10,000 for failure to maintain certain records. The following factors are indicative of a lack of supervision or working knowledge. This was a recent question, and you've got 7 factors here that are a lack of working knowledge. Slightly, subtly different than the list that's in 111.1 of what is responsible supervision and control, but it's something that Customs wants you to kind of be aware of. Okay, let me see if there was anything else that I wanted to point out in this appendix, and I know this is detailed, and I'm sorry. What are the limits of the penalty assessments? $30,000 from Customs for any one penalty notice. All right. Now, move on to Appendix D. This applies only to drawback, and there's been 2 things that Customs has tested over time. One, There's only two mental states for fines or penalties on drawback violations: negligence and fraud. I don't know why there's no gross negligence, but there's not. Customs tested that once. The other thing Customs has tested, what are the penalties in drawback penalties from Section 1593? Okay, don't panic when you see those numbers. Well, the maximum penalties for drawback fraud is cannot exceed 3 times the potential loss of revenue for Customs. If it's negligent, not to exceed 20%. Repeated violations, not to exceed 50%. So those are the things that Customs has tested on drawback penalties, and that's it. Those are all our penalties. So I want you to break this down into really two main areas. You've got our table in Chapter 22, which applies to importers, and those are 592 penalties, 19 USC 1592 penalties. And then you've got this Appendix C in 171, which are broker penalties. Those tend to be what Customs concentrates on. There are occasionally you'll see an Appendix D penalty on drawback things, but it's actually not very frequent. Okay, now let me get back to our slides here. We're almost done, really, with this stuff. Real quick note on seizures. Again, this is straight out fines and penalties. There are some items that Customs must seize, like they just got to seize it. That's drugs, stolen or smuggled goods, or whatever contraband is. And then there's some items if Customs find, the regulations say Customs, they can seize it if they want to. They may seize it. They don't have to. Restricted goods not in compliance, and those which threaten health and safety. I would think they would have to, but apparently it's permissible. Licensed or permitted goods that are not in compliance. Goods with copyright, trade name, or trademark violations or intentional marketing violations. These may be seized. They don't have to be seized. That's just drugs, stolen goods, and things like that. Now, I do want you to know on seizures, Customs can't seize goods that are admissible simply because there's a valuation dispute or a classification is wrong or in dispute. That's not allowed. They deal with you in other ways, but they don't get to seize that. Okay, if that's the only issue. All right, that's it on fines, forfeitures, and penalties. We've got good questions at the online test center, and good area to know. The next, I actually wouldn't do the questions right now. I'd go ahead and look at the rest of Chapter 22, which is petitions for relief, because I think it's kind of a whole. It looks better to kind of have the whole thing under wraps. All right, you don't have to. You can go look at the questions right now on fines, penalties, forfeitures, seizures if you want to. That's it. We'll see you next time. Thanks.